who is a researcher at the German Development Institute. And he'll be reflecting on the process and outcome of the T20 process during Germany's G20 presidency. Dr. Berger.
Excellencies, dear colleagues, thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to present the main features and outcomes of the T20 process during Germany's G20 presidency. But first of all, obviously, I would like to thank Dr. Katuria and ICRIER not only for inviting me to this very important conference, but also for their very active engagement in the T20 process in 2017. Among others in the task forces on ending hunger and the 2030 agenda. Also, ICRIER is a key partner of my institute, the German Development Institute, in the Managing Global Governance program, and we are very grateful for that. So I'm very happy to be here and to be speaking to you today. In less than a month's time, leaders of the G20 countries will gather in Hamburg, Germany, for their annual summit discussing matters of international cooperation among the world's most powerful economies. But this is where the similarities to past summits might end. Since the summit falls into a period of heightened international turbulences, the outcome and the ambition of the G20 process under Germany's leadership is highly uncertain, with growing anti-globalist and populist sentiments in key member countries. The G20, from my perspective, faces a double fragmentation. There is a risk that this fragmentation becomes visible both within the negotiation room, as the interests of the G20 leaders seem to increasingly diverge on many issues, and outside of the negotiation room, as civil society activists are questioning whether the G20 is at all capable of addressing the problems facing people around the world. This double fragmentation is fueled by the increasing discrepancies between the progressive integration of the global economy and the rapid technological advance as a result of digitalization, and ongoing social discontent. As a result, the effectiveness and legitimacy of the G20 is questioned and is at stake. Against this background, think tanks too face new challenges. In the context of the G20, think tanks are asked to provide evidence-based policy solutions on an increasingly broad array of cross-border challenges ranging from financial stability, tax erosion, protectionism, to global warming, migration, and food security. To fulfill this task, think tanks need to engage in joint knowledge creation, working transnational networks and across disciplines. In light of annually rotating G20 presidencies, these networks have to be built on a continuous basis to actually serve as an ideas bank for the G20. Furthermore, in times of widespread criticism against elites, to which we belong, if we like it or not, think tanks need to better communicate with the broader public. Think tanks from G20 countries, as you might know, collaborate since the Mexican G20 presidency in 2012 in the context of the Think 20, or T20 for short. As you may know, the T20 process in 2017 was led by my institute, the German Development Institute, and the Kiel Institute for the World Economy. And in light of the above-mentioned challenges, our aim was to deepen the interactions among think tanks of the T20. Let me highlight some of the elements of the 2017 T20 process. First of all, in addition to the usual T20 conferences, the T20 process this year was built on thematic task forces, focusing on key issues on the G20 agenda. In addition to the traditional economic and financial issues, the G20 process focused on issues related to sustainable development, such as the implementation of the 2030 agenda, inequality, cooperation with Africa, and obviously also global warming. These task forces brought together hundreds of researchers from different countries and different disciplines to develop evidence-based policy recommendations for the G20. Crucially, these task forces interacted with the chairs of the various work streams of the G20 to ensure the relevance of our policy recommendations. The main goal of the task forces was to produce policy briefs. The task forces have produced a wide variety of policy briefs, over 70 policy briefs, which have been brought together on the newly established G20 Insights Platform. Second, during the G20 process, my institute, DIE, and the Kiel Institute organized 3 conferences. In addition to the kickoff conference in early December and our G20 summit, which took place just last week, the G20 gathered for a first conference in Africa. As you may know, Africa is high on the agenda of the German G20 presidency. The conference was organized in close cooperation with the South African Institute for International Affairs, SIA, and the G20 Africa conference, called Africa and the G20, Building Alliances for Sustainable Development, provided an important forum to develop perspectives on the Africa G20 cooperation together with African partners, working at the interface of science and politics in order to institutionalize the interaction between the G20 and African think tanks. A G20 Africa Standing Group was established last week at the occasion of the G20 summit in Berlin. My third point, in order to communicate more effectively with the broader public, the G20 runs a rather successful blog that publishes voices from the G20, but also other stakeholders, on important issues on the G20. In addition, the G20 engages in a dialogue with the other engagement groups, like B20, the business sector, C20, civil society, or WT20, Women 20. And these dialogues resulted in a number of public statements, for example, such as on an open society on the occasion of the G20 foreign ministers meeting mid-February in Bonn, or 2 statements on climate policy published by T20, B20, for example. My fourth point, one of the key issues of the G20, and I think this is also a future challenge, is to address or is to foster continuity of its actions. We have made one step in this regard by establishing a G20 Insights Platform with the idea to develop this online platform into a central hub for policy recommendations of the G20 for the G20. We think further steps are needed in order to establish more permanent structures of the G20 to complement and support the annually rotating G20 chairs. Now, I have talked about the main features and outcomes of the G20 process in 2017. Let me now turn to some of the key recommendations developed by the G20 task forces, because that's, from our perspective, that's the main goal, main objective of the G20, to produce knowledge-based, innovative, concrete policy proposals for the G20. These recommendations are compiled in the document you see here, 20 solutions for the G20. You can download this from our website, G20germany.org. And the 20 key recommendations are clustered along 5 main dimensions: digitalization, global economy, climate policy and finance, global inequalities, as well as the 2030 agenda. So the first cluster of policy proposals relates to the challenge posed by digitalization as a driver of global change. The T20 Task Force on the Digital Economy produced recommendations both on employment, education policies that are needed to increase the inclusiveness of digitalization, as well as on the necessary safeguards to enhance the safety of digital networks. Furthermore, blockchains are highlighted as an innovative tool to improve the effectiveness and accountability of global governance. The second cluster addressed recommendations on building a stable, sustainable, and resilient global economy. Proposals from the T20 range from measures to remove inconsistency across financial regulatory regimes, establishing a global pact for sustainable trade and sustainable global value chains, to removing inconsistencies from to transparency on tax standards, for example. Furthermore, the T20 proposes measures to initiate a more structured engagement of the G20 and Africa. With regard to the third cluster, climate policy and finance, the relevant T20 task force suggests to leverage market forces and multilateral development banks to support low-carbon growth and to address the distributional effects of climate policy. But Amar, I guess you will talk more about these topics in the course of this conference. In the fourth cluster, the T20 calls upon the G20 to reshape global food systems, one topic that has been discussed in the morning already. Through an integrated approach to needs, resources, and policies in order to trigger targeted investments. Also, the T20 suggests measures to make water use more sustainable. The T20 developed also a number of recommendations on the issue of forced migration, which I will present tomorrow in the session on migration. Last but not least, the T20 calls upon the G20 to strongly renew its commitment to the implementation of the 2030 Agenda on Sustainable Development and stresses the key role of the multilateral system in this regard. As I said, you will find that the 20 recommendations in this document. Please download it from our website, and I would also encourage you to have a look at the G20 Insights Platform. You find it at g20-insights.org, where we posted all of the policy briefs that have been published by the T20 task forces. Let me end by saying that we are very much looking forward to engage with our partners in Argentina and the next presidency to make the T20 ever deeper and ever more effective network, and both the German Development Institute and the Kiel Institute for the World Economy are very happy to engage with our partners and to continue the cooperation in the T20 network. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Berger, for sharing your deep knowledge about the process and outcomes of the T20 process during Germany's G20 presidency. Now we move to the first technical session, which is on global economic growth and policy coordination. This session shall be chaired by Professor Shankaracharya, who is an honorary professor at ICRIER. And among the panelists, we have Herbert Dieter, who is a senior fellow at the German Institute for International and Security Affairs, Errol de Souza, who is a professor at Indian Institute of Management, Ahmedabad, and Ratna Sahai, who is a deputy director, Monetary and Capital Markets Department, IMF. over to you, Professor Acharya. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, welcome everybody to this annual exercise. And before I turn it over to the panelists, who are really the people who are billed for this particular session, as a chair, I think I should be un-Indian and speak as little as possible. But you know, being really Indian, I can't resist saying a few things. So just a couple of sort of introductory remarks. First, I was reminded at a dinner last night that, and I think this may be true, that of all the people in this room as well, only 2 were actually present at the creation of the G20 process, which of course initially was at the finance minister's level. One of them was Dr. Reddy, who all of you know, and the other was me. Because this was organized, and it wasn't 20 countries at that time, it was I think 33 or something like that. And there was a meeting organized under the auspices of the US leadership in the Willard Hotel in Washington. And 1998 perhaps, Venu? Yeah. So that's just a tidbit, as they say. So I'm a bit like an ancient mariner here, kind of hanging around when a lot of things have changed. The second thing I have to say is that when I was asked to chair a session in this conference, perhaps in fact a little later, when I was asked, it wasn't quite so bad. You know, when the principal hegemon in the country, in the world rather, seems to be not particularly interested in multilateral cooperation in a whole range of domains, some of which have fallen within the G20 ambit, you know, I do wonder what the utility of what we do here, how high that is. I suppose it's a case of really battling on for the future and hoping for the best. Couple of comments I can't resist making on the first session, at least the half of it that I was able to attend. I think I sensed that Dr. Subramanian, because I came in late, so I may have missed his actual talk, but from the discussion, that Arvind Subramanian had taken a somewhat skeptical view of some of the successes of the G20 at the summit level in the last few years. And I just want to say that I have a similar, if you like, sympathy to that view. The big so-called success, I think that a lot of people who praised coordination in the early years at the summit level G20 refer, I think, to the meetings that occurred in 2009 and 2010 perhaps, late 2009 and first half of 2010, which basically gave strong endorsement to policies that, in my view, were already in place, namely fiscal stimulus by national governments of the G20 countries and others, and monetary loosening by the relevant central banks. And I think it's an interesting counterfactual to ask, if you didn't have a G20 institutional structure, how much of a difference in policy you would have got from either the national finance ministries of these G20 countries or the central banks of these G20 countries in the follow-up to the global financial crisis. It's a question that one, I suppose, can't answer, but my kind of hypothesis, untestable and therefore a safe one, is that not hell of a lot. That, I mean, basically, really you talk to anybody at that time, given plummeting national output and many other consequences of the global financial crisis and the so-called Great Recession, really there wasn't much option but to step up fiscal stimulus and loosen monetary policy dramatically, and everybody did it, or almost everybody. And my untestable hypothesis is that most of this would have occurred anyway, whether you had a G20 structure or not. One last thought on capital controls, which I understood came up in the discussion in the first session. While the G20 system may not have been a major force for loosening capital controls where they existed, particularly in developing nations in the noughties and later, I do remember that in the 1990s, pre-G20, and pre even the Asian crisis, which led to the formation of the G20 in the first place, that there was a fair amount of pressure from the US and IMF and other leading industrialized countries on nations like us to really go for much more rapid capital account convertibility. Indeed, there was a move to, in fact, amend the articles of the IMF to build this into place. And one of the uncomfortable challenges that some of us officials at that time had, and Montek is sitting here, and I hope he has memories which are not too variant from mine, that we had to fight off quite a lot of the stuff. And luckily, of course, we were aided at a rather high cost, I have to say, by the Asian financial crisis, which I think for a good long time put a dampener on the bandwagon for the kind of great capital convertibility bandwagon. Well, I think enough of introductory remarks, and I guess I've been more Indian than un-Indian. I'm sorry about that, as far as the role of the chairman is concerned. Now, I've been given in the program sheets 2 different orderings of how I invite the speakers, so I'm a bit of a loss. Do I follow this or do I follow this? I think I'll go with the first one which I got, which is which says it is Professor Dieter first, and followed by Professor de Souza, and lastly, if you don't mind, Ratana. So let's follow that. Given the time is something like 12 to 15 minutes, okay? Okay? So.
Yeah, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you very much, first of all, to the organizers for inviting me back to Delhi. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you very much to Rajat Kataruria and also to Matthias Helper from ADBI for facilitating that conference on a topic which continues to be interesting. This is the 9th conference of ICRIER on G20, and we don't seem to be running out of topics. I think, as a matter of fact, it becomes more interesting every year. And many people have argued, and I would like to start with that, last year, that 2016 has been somewhat of a turning point. It has been mentioned before. We had Brexit, we had Trump, we continue to have Trump. And I think this is, it is very important to keep in mind that indeed something dramatic changed in 2016. But I dare to argue that not everything was all that well before those 2 events in 2016 occurred. And we look at international economic relations, I think it is fair to say that we had quite a few problems before Trump entered the world stage. And I start, of course, with trade. has been mentioned before, trade, the important pillar, I think the most important pillar, and I will argue a little bit why I think that, of international economic relations, is in a difficult situation. You could say, quoting Jagdish Bhagwati, that trade policy is in a mess. There are termites in the system, and the multilateral system is at least in hibernation, which is regrettable. And the G20 didn't contribute all that much to solving that problem. In finance, we have what the economist has called balkanization. We are leaving the goal of global rules behind us, and every country, at least some countries, are developing their own set of rules. To start with, the United States of America, followed last year by the European Union, no longer accept host country regulation, home country regulation in finance, which means previously Deutsche Bank was regulated in Frankfurt and only in Frankfurt. The United States no longer accepts that. They have to hold capital in the United States of America if they want to operate there, and the same applies now for countries, for banks that want to operate in the European Union. So we have problems in trade, we have problems in finance, we had significant problems in global governance. It has not been mentioned explicitly before. Everybody's aware of it. The United States didn't play all that a constructive a role in the modernization of the International Monetary Fund, very diplomatically speaking. As a matter of fact, 6 years, the US Congress blocked a proposal for IMF reform. And it was, I think, courtesy of the Chinese move to create the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank that raised awareness in Washington that there's a world out there that may not wait for Washington to move. Finally, we got the approval by Washington. I think it is fair to say that 2016 has been correctly labeled as the year of populism in many countries. Francis Fukuyama wrote a very nice essay in Foreign Affairs published before the election of Trump in August 2016, and he argues that it is surprising that populism took so long to develop. He says it's not surprising that it happens, it's surprising that it took so long. And he said, and I quote, and we are all, it was already mentioned by Mr. Berger, we are all part of that game that is divided between somewheres and anywheres. Fukuyama said, populism is the label that political elites attach to policies supported by ordinary citizens that they don't like. Now, you may not disagree with that assessment, but I think it is fair to say that in some parts of the world, we see resentment against globalization, and I think it is very important, and this is the topic of the conference, that we kind of re-evaluate the benefits and the drawbacks of globalization. I do not think that there is a kind of dichotomy. We either go back to the dark ages or we have, as Thomas Friedman called it, hyperglobalization. I think what is on the agenda is what I would call globalization à la carte or tailor-made globalization. Societies want to choose which level of integration into the global economy is appropriate for them. That is not a small feat. That means some dimensions of deep integration into the global economy they may not choose to elect. This is, of course, based on research by Daniel Roderick, who said there is a trilemma. Societies have to choose between hyperglobalization, democracy, and the nation state. You can only have 2 out of 3, and if you want to have democracy, you can either have the nation state or hyperglobalization, and I think that is a fair assessment. Something that also occurred in recent years is, I think, quite puzzling. For a long period of time, the world seemed to think that countries that have not yet fully globalized, that have not shared the norms and values of the West, will eventually do so, in particular China. So China will become like the West. more or less. Interestingly, now the West becomes more like China, which is quite surprising. You know? The West becomes more authoritarian. You listen to Theresa May's speech on Sunday after that terrible attack in London. Yeah? More authoritarian, more nationalistic, more emphasis on the national interest, and we know who we are thinking about, and less cosmopolitan. So this is something where the West learns from China. I'm not sure whether I should say learns in quotation marks, but it becomes more, the West becomes a little bit more like China, and I think this is very interesting. Looking on some of the prospects that we have, of course, in trade, the situation for those that believe in mega-regional trade agreements looks bleak. TPP is unlikely, unless a major Anglo-Saxon power that is interested in redefining its trade relationships replaces another Anglo-Saxon player in TPP, but that is perhaps a bit far-fetched. TTIP is, again, a distant prospect, the transatlantic trade and investment partnerships. It seems too early to tell whether Donald Trump is indeed looking for that level of trouble that he kind of suggests, that he's looking for that kind of trouble, withdrawing his country from international trade. I think he will not go that far, but I can't exclude it completely. What I would like to argue is, for those that have followed the US, have followed policies in the United States of America, this is not new. People who say that Trump is the first kind of nationalist player in US politics, I think they are wrong. And I would like to suggest to look back to Roosevelt. Roosevelt, in his inauguration speech of March 4, 1933, said, "America first, international economic cooperation later." Now, his rhetoric was better and his style was more diplomatic, but the essence was the same. We have to look after our own interests, and the rest of the world will have to live with that. And basically, Trump says that in a more blunt way, but it is not that this kind of thinking, which I would call Jacksonian tradition, has not been present in the United States of America. What is at stake, and it has been said clearly in the first presentation of Mr. Subramanian, what is at stake is globalization of trade relations. The big beneficiaries of globalization in the last decades have been societies that have been able to develop themselves out of poverty. Just the data, we had 42% of the global population living in poverty with less than $1.90 a day in 1981. That has dropped to 10%, still too many, but this is a major achievement, and that should not be forgotten when we talk about reshaping globalization. The International Division of Labor would suffer if Mr. Trump will have his way. And also, in addition, and that was already raised briefly before, the same cannot be said about the liberalization of capital flows. Even the IMF, Mr. Chairman, is now reconsidering the utility of unrestricted capital flows. Even Stanley Fischer, dare I say, Stanley Fischer recently questioned the social utility of short-term capital flows. And if you have Stanley Fischer as a witness, you can really say that many decades of experience in international finance back that assessment. So the question here is, and this is again the topic we have to discuss, is neoliberalism oversold, which is not my title, but which is the title of a publication of the IMF last year. Segmentation of financial markets may be a good thing rather than a bad thing, and I would just like to remind you that in Bretton Woods, when we had segmented financial markets, we didn't have a single banking crisis in the largest 21 economies in those decades. So I would like to come to not an end, but to a kind of a prospect. Where do I see major problems in the organization of global economic policy and of policy coordination. And of course, it's easy to say that the United States of America are causing trouble, but I would like to add another country, and that is my country, that is Germany. I think it is important to ask whether Germany is as constructive a player as it thinks it is. But let me first come again to the United States of America, and we know there is a problem in Washington. That problem is rather large and rather loud. That problem won't go away all that easily, and it is unlikely to expect that anytime soon Mr. Trump will turn multilateral. Not this year, and most probably not next year. Again, I'm arguing this is not new. Madeleine Albright, foreign minister to Bill Clinton's administration in the 1990s, said, "Our first preference is unilateralism." I mean, this is not in a secret meeting. She said that publicly. She says, the United States has a preference for unilateralism. If necessary, we will cooperate with like-minded countries. And as a last resort, we will embrace multilateralism, as a last resort. Foreign Minister of the United States 20 years ago. So that's not new, and the rest of the world will be having to live with a rather unwilling United States for the time being. The problem in monetary policy, and I come to Europe now, is that the European Central Bank may be providing Mr. Trump with the ammunition he needs to slap tariffs on imports on Europe. Again, that has happened before. Nixon did it in the early 70s. If the European Central Bank continues with its ultra-loose monetary policy at a time when the United States Federal Reserve is moving, then we have a problem. And that problem cannot be blamed exclusively on the Americans. The ECB could do something about it as well. You are all aware of the fact that growth in Europe is not as bad as it was. We're looking at 2% growth, which would be too small here, but it is quite good in Europe. And consequently, the ultra-loose monetary policy of the European Central Bank looks rather out of place. But now let me come to that second spoil sport, not the United States, but the Federal Republic of Germany. And you are all aware that Germany has been criticized for its surpluses for a long period of time. The trouble is they continue to grow. They don't shrink. And Germany last year produced a record current account surplus of almost 300 billion euros, 270-something billion euros. And this is a problem. It continues to be a problem. Virtually all our friends and neighbors criticize us for that current account surplus. France criticizes us. Of course, Italy criticizes us. The IMF criticizes us. The European Commission criticizes us. To no avail. It just doesn't have any effect on German policymakers. Mr. Schäuble, for whom I have a lot of respect, but he continues to say, we can't do anything about it. What shall we do? Our companies are so efficient. Our cars are so wonderful. What shall we do? The German economics minister earlier this year said, well, if the Americans want to buy fewer German cars, they should build better Cadillacs. But that would be an option, but I think there's a little bit more to it, and I think Germany should talk about it. I do not want to go into the details of the balance of payments, but it is of course very clear that Germany doesn't only import too little and export too much, it also saves too much and invests too little. And it is inappropriate to suggest that the German government couldn't do anything about it. It is unwilling to do anything about it, but it is not impossible to do anything about it. One thing that could be done, we could simply lower value-added tax, which was, as far as I understand, introduced in this country with great effort. But the good thing about value-added tax is you can change the level of taxation. If we would do that, the German government would automatically slide into deficit, which would result in German savings being used to finance the deficit of the German government rather than financing consumption and investment abroad. It is very simple. It could be done. I'm not saying that this is the only avenue, but when the German government says it is impossible to do anything about it, this is inappropriate, and I think it is incorrect. And it is a problem for our partners. If Germany produces surpluses, somebody else has to borrow. And we know that over time, countries that borrow may have a problem. And I think it is time for Germany to consider the effect of that policy on the rest of Europe and on the rest of the world. The problem is that, and this has been heavily criticized, for instance, by Martin Wolf in the Financial Times, the Eurozone becomes like Greater Germany. So it's not that German surplus savings are staying in Europe. No, the Eurozone itself becomes a Greater Germany, meaning that the current account surplus of the Eurozone, which was moderate in 2010, it was $50 billion in 2010, has risen to $500 billion last year, which means the rest of the world has to be willing to borrow from the Eurozone to the same tune of $500 billion, which may be a problem. So I think it is time for a discussion on some sanctions for surplus countries, and this is nothing new. Keynes suggested that in Bretton Woods. There have been many discussions about it. Madame Lagarde from the IMF said, well, a German surplus of 4% of GDP would be okay, but 8% is too much, and I think this is absolutely correct. A certain surplus is okay, but an ever-growing surplus might be a bit of a problem and is indeed a problem. Now, the last point, and this is, of course, on Trump. What does the world, what should the rest of the world do in a time of Donald Trump? And I take this proposal that was made earlier, I take this as a Dalai Lama attitude. What's good about Donald Trump? Now I could stop here, but there are things that are useful. And I think I have already spotted it in the debate earlier. Countries like India are now owning globalization, are seeing that there is something to be lost. And I recall, it's not that long ago, permit me saying, that when traveling to India, one was always reminded that India is exploited and so on and so forth. In 2016, I hear that there is something to lose from the perspective of India. So that is an advantage. I think it was a little bit entertaining when the leader of a slightly mercantilist economy was traveling to Davos earlier this year and portrayed himself as the leader of free trade, or as the person that would guarantee free trade. But there is an opportunity in Trump, as said before. The United States has had a difficulty embracing globalization in recent years, and this could, of course, be positive in the sense that other countries see the need for their own kind of contribution to the governance of the global economy, and in particular to maintaining an open trading system. So could we think, and this is of course the last point I will make, could we envisage a WTO without the United States of America? Seems to be rather absurd. I don't think it's entirely impossible. When the IMF was suffering from the boycott of Congress, Edwin Truman suggested a supra fund should be created, which was a rather radical proposal by Mr. Truman. He said, well, let's just create a new fund without the Americans. hoping that the Americans would eventually join. Well, if that is necessary, why not do that in the WTO as well? Why not, if those countries that want to move on, that see trade as an opportunity rather than as a problem, as Mr. Trump does it, why not move on and do something for the and create an open multilateral trading system, which has been so beneficial in the past? Why not do that without the US? The GATT existed without the USSR and China. The WTO may, although this is not, don't get me wrong, I'm not advocating that, but if there is no other opportunity, we may be forced to think about that. It is legitimate that the US implements policies that it sees appropriate. Many trade economists and other observers see them, not to talk about climate change, see them as unwise, but we can't force them to change their perception. And seen that way, the process of international policy coordination may even receive a boost by Mr. Trump's recalcitrant actions. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Dieter, for those fairly provocative thoughts. And I'm glad you hold out hopes, rays of light perhaps in the dark clouds ahead of us. Now my pleasure to call on Professor Errol de Souza.
Thank you, Shankar, and I'd like to thank ICRIER also for having me here at this conference. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm going to restrict myself, given the time limitation, on just one particular issue, and that is the issue of globalization associated with capital flows. Capital flows, we know, can result in credit booms, and credit booms then can result in financial crises. Okay? The result is that most countries which are subject to capital flows respond in two ways. Okay? One is you increase your foreign exchange reserves, and the second is you involve yourself in putting up, some sort of capital entry barriers. So there is restrictions on capital mobility. So the question I want to ask is, given this scenario, okay, do you really need policy coordination? Okay? And given this sort of scenario, how do policies interact between countries? Okay? And I'm going to do this by focusing on just one small aspect, okay, just as a way of caricaturing the actual thing. I'm going to focus on macro-prudential regulation. Okay? Because currently a large part of the debate happens to be around that, and it's also a good way of focusing on the problem and giving us some insights about this particular issue. So let me start out by just doing a very simple toy model, and my apologies to those in the audience who will be wondering as to whether I'm going to get technical on this. I'm not. Okay. This is a simple scenario. Think of the savings of a country increasing with interest rates, okay, and also of course affected by incomes and life cycles and other sorts of stories. Okay. And think of investments as basically the marginal returns, okay, on an investment as declining. This is a very standard sort of a scenario. Okay. And think of a global interest rate. Okay. And therefore now the distance between those two lines, okay, I and S, is nothing but your current account deficit, right? And that sort of means that you need to fund it, and you need to fund it through some sort of capital flows. Okay. Now, supposing for simplicity that your investment is basically financed through debt, okay, and the more debt there is, then the more is there a likelihood of systemic crisis. The more is the chance that, for example, if one firm faces a shock and is unable to pay, then firms it takes inputs from, for example, will find a reduction in demand or a reduction in price, and then they will also have a problem in their own repayment schedules. And so the more debt is used, for example, to finance investment projects, the more systemic crises are possible. Okay? And that means that the investment curve that I have drawn, okay, is not taking into account this externality, this fact that large part of it could lead to systemic crisis. Okay? And so the social return is this blue curve, okay, which really, the distance between those two is really the amount of the estimated possible systemic crisis as investments increase. Okay? Now, any country which sees this would therefore like to reduce systemic crises, okay, from this particular capital flows. Remember that your capital flows is really the distance between your S star and I star private there, and you would like to reduce that. Okay? So you would institute some sort of capital regulation. Okay? And I'm going to sort of take it very simply that this is some sort of macro-prudential regulation which imposes some sort of a tax, let's say, on capital inflows. Okay? The moment you do that, then your cost of capital has gone up by the amount of that tax. Okay? And you can immediately see that in that diagram, what's happened is I've reduced your current account deficit, okay? And therefore the amount of capital flows that are taking place. And I've also, in a sense, had a benefit in terms of lower systemic crises that are possible. Okay? So for those who are into doing welfare analysis on this, what you see is here one triangle where I've reduced the amount of systemic crisis. But there is another triangle on top, which means that I've increased savings or I've reduced consumption. So there's a benefit and cost to capital controls. Okay? I induce most internal savings to substitute for the foreign savings that I was using. But at the same time, I'm reducing some of the possible systemic crisis that capital flows could have created in my economy. And really, policy is, in a sense, a trade-off between these two types of issues. Okay? Now, the moment you have done that, therefore, what you've really done is you have reduced capital flows to your own country. But what happens at a global level is the interesting question. At a global level, each country might be putting in its own tax, right? And so its own savings may be going up, right? And since now cost of capital has gone up, investment is also coming down. So if all countries' savings is going up, investment is coming down, the global interest rate is actually going to fall. Okay? So the I star, which I had drawn earlier, imagine that line shifting down. Okay? And as the global interest rate falls, okay, it actually means I'm deflecting capital flows from my country to another country. Okay? And therefore, I have created, in a sense, some sort of an externality for another country. Okay? And this is, to my mind, the heart of the problem. That the moment you put in capital controls, okay, you're trying to solve a problem for your country, but you're deflecting capital to another country. That country will have an incentive to put in capital controls. And you would actually have global interest rates falling as a consequence, and even more build up of this sort of an amplification of capital flow problems across the world. Okay? So the question then is, should I therefore have policy coordination? Okay? And my thoughts on this are no. Even though there seems to be an externality, in a sense, macro-prudential regulations are some sort of strategic complements. I would still argue that you do not need to have policy coordination across countries because unlike a standard externality, here is a thing which is affecting countries through a price mechanism, through the interest rate. Okay? And in an externality, as we know, it's typically unpriced, which is why you want some sort of policy in place. Okay? But here, it's being priced in through the global interest rate. Okay? And therefore, without going too much into the technical details, I would actually argue that even though you have a phenomenon which is detrimental, okay, it is difficult and it may not be appropriate to have policy coordination across countries on this. Okay? Just as a sort of a side thought to that, I mean, in my quick response to what the previous speaker had actually said is that supposing I cut the VAT, okay, in a country, okay, it may have some of the consequences that he talked about, But my thinking would be that the moment you do that, you are reducing your prices, you're actually increasing your real exchange rate, you're depreciating it, and actually Germany would export more. Okay? So there are these costs and benefits, and so it's very difficult in these policy coordinations exercises to not take into account these effects that take place in a general equilibrium setting. Okay? So my first point really is that it is nice to think about policy coordination, but I believe that if we think about it technically, it may not give us desired results because of the nature in which, by which we are using regulations to handle a particular problem. The second issue I want to talk about is something which is again growing in the international financial system. I mean, the big difference between the Asian crisis and the recent crisis was that in the Asian crisis, less than maybe 20% of capital flows were actually flows of banking capital. Okay? But in the recent crisis, maybe 60% is the estimate, is what was banking capital flows. Banking capital really surged pre-2008. Okay? And if you look at it, it was really global banks sourcing capital in, let's say, the big capital markets, say in the US, okay? And then sending it to their headquarter banks in other countries. And that was the way in which capital was flowing between countries. Okay? This is not just big. Recently, one of the biggest banks which is doing it, interestingly, is a Chinese bank. Okay? The Industrial and Commercial Bank of China is now the biggest player in the repo market in the US, aside from JP Morgan. Okay? And so they actually raise money over there, transfer it to their home country bank, which then transfers it to borrowers in the home country. Now here is a standard issue of possible systemic crisis, which actually led to some of the problems we saw in the global financial system in 2008. And it's sort of rearing its head again, but now with new global banks rather than the old global banks. Okay? And the reason it rears its head is because the countries who are receiving these capital flows are responding, as I said in the beginning, by trying to raise the amount of reserves that they hold. Okay? By doing that, you're actually converting foreign currency into domestic currency, if you think about it. Okay? Think of a simple scenario, say HSBC raises money in, let's say in London from its headquarter bank, okay? And brings it to HSBC India. Okay? And let's say the RBI is worried about currency appreciation, right? So let's say HSBC India then does some sort of a swap with the RBI and immediately gets domestic currency without having paid anything in the interbank market. Okay? And then it uses that money to buy assets in India, or it lends it in the interbank market. Immediately, you have coordinated a foreign currency market, an interbank market, and an asset market. And this linkage between the three is a dangerous concoction. It's what has actually led to crises in the past. Okay? You may say that the central bank can get rid of this through sterilization. But sterilization would basically mean that HSBC would then say that I'm willing to give you back the money. It depends on its decision on relative rates of return. Okay? It might not want, some other bank might participate in the sterilization process. Okay? Alternatively, HSBC might also participate in the sterilization process, but then it gives up liquidity for a safe asset, and it can again use that safe asset as collateral in order to build up financial imbalances. So I don't see sterilization also, by the way, the standard classical response is that it raises interest rates and actually leads to even more capital inflows. So you have this, interesting dynamics by which foreign currency markets, interbank markets, and asset markets are highly intertwined. You could even have a scenario, and it has happened, that HSBC might say, okay, now that I've got this money from a foreign bank and got it in domestic currency, I now lend it to, let's say, a hedge fund in the US, which wants to buy assets here. Okay? And again, I've created another dynamic which is problematic. Okay? So, there are no, easy answers to this sort of a thing. My by looking at phenomena like these, I believe that the time has sort of come to think about these interactions between these markets, okay, and what sort of responses we can have. Okay. A quick response, okay, which is worth considering, and of course which is considered in India and a few other countries, is to actually look at it from the point of view of, do these things lead to credit booms? So we'll be very careful about credit buildups which are not ordinary. And one good macro-prudential regulation to look at, therefore, is the credit to GDP ratio. Okay? If that is growing systematically out of bounds with what its general trend rate is, something is going wrong. Okay? And then you should be trying to actually handle that and get rid of the amplification cycles that may be taking place in the economy. Okay? So let me I stop here because my 12 minutes is over. As I said, I have just two simple points to make. First, I'm not sure policy coordination solves the problem, because even though you deflect capital from one country to another, as I argued, the problem is it's not a strict externality. Okay? It is being priced in the system. Okay? And the second is that now there's so many linkages between aspects of the financial system that you have to bother about, where is the end usage of this finance, keep track of it, and then think back about what sort of regulatory process would actually solve that. And my favored intervention is to look at credit GDP ratios and be bothered about the effects of that on the economy. Thank you.